and good afternoon, everyone. In the past weeks, we've looked at how we specify who we want. We've looked in the first webinar. We looked at the overview of the whole process, and now it's time to actually get down to talking about how we find candidates. That's quite significant because obviously, if we don't have any candidates, we can have a perfect selection process. But if we can't actually find people who are interested in our job, then we're going to fail to actually get a new member of staff. So we've got to look at the process of getting hold of people. I want today to, first of all, give you a bit of a metaphor that allows some thought about how you go about this. I then want to look just a quick review of the sort of classical ways of doing it. I'm not altogether convinced that the current way that most people use is good, and I'll say why. Then I want to give you a sort of overview of the structure of the whole affair so that you can understand alternatives to the traditional ways of working. In the middle, I'll have a little play with, I want to try and tease out how long it takes to actually do these things, how long it takes to recruit people. And I want to just tease out some of the issues there. And then we'll wrap it up by just looking at the practical aspects of how much it's going to cost and perhaps an idea of the degrees of freedom. The more we constrain things, the more we're going to give ourselves problems when we're recruiting. So there we are. Without more ado, let's away. The first thing to do is really to introduce to you a metaphor. It's fishing. Recruitment is like fishing. So, in other words, search is like fishing. Selection, we'll break the metaphor as soon as we start talking about selection. But search is like fishing. In other words, if you want a freshwater trout, if you want to catch a freshwater trout, this description here, where we're looking here, is probably a sea loch or a sea inlet. And if we're looking for a freshwater trout, well, they're not there. So you're wasting your time trying to fish for one of them. So we must align the place we're fishing, the line we're using, the lure we're using, the tackle we're using, and the techniques of fishing we're using. If, for example, we're looking for place flatfish or whatever, and we're coming off the beach, then we're going to use very specific beach casting rod, and we're going to use a similar lure to be able to get way out into the distance where these flatfish feed. So we've got to use the same kind of idea. And actually, funnily enough, the metaphor is really quite good when it comes to landing the catch, when actually it comes to landing the person and getting the person on board your company. It's a bit like fighting a large fish with a very light line. One tug and you snap, and you've to really play the fish, to actually play the person, to be sure that they actually land. It's not an easy job. It's not just a case of bang, there's an offer. Oh, right, thank you very much. I'm really welcome your offer. Of course, I'll join. It's not as simple. And we will come later on to that process. But anyway, for now, we're talking about search. So the metaphor is fishing. And when you think about search, think fishing. What am I using? What's my lure? Where am I trying to fish, etc. Now, you've already got all the background to that. We've covered that in defining the person we want. So if we know the person, in other words, the fish, if we know the person we want, well, we know where to go. We know how to go about finding that person. And that's a lot about what we're going to talk about in the next few minutes. So, and of course, like fishing, if we want to extend this metaphor, we can wait a long time for a fish. Anyway, more about that. The first and traditional method of search is, of course, to use a third-party agency, to use a recruitment agency. And here's one, Robert Half. Robert Half, incidentally, do a very good salary benchmarking report every year on various different professions and trades. But that's beside the point. We've got the idea of a recruitment agency. They have, and you can see it very clearly here, on the one hand, the need to hire, on the other hand, are you looking for a job? Are you a candidate or are you an employer? And of course, the aim behind these guys is to offer a website when you actually are matching CVs, in other words, people to jobs. And of course, what happens is those agents, if there is an agency behind it, and some of them I have to say, and we'll come to this in a moment, some of those are only websites. Some of them have no people behind them. All they are is a kind of shoveling service between, or matching service between the two. But if we've got people behind them in the classic recruitment consultant type of activity, then you give a brief to the recruitment agency. They take the brief. They then look in their databases because, of course, they've got databases of people. They look in their databases and they marry the two up. And that's very simply the way it's done. It's not ideal, far from ideal. The people that are actually doing it, if there are agents behind it, the people who are doing it, be slightly derogatory here, a lot of the people who are doing it have previously been in jobs like estate agency and the like. So we're not using specialists, we're using very much keywords. And of course, the more computers are used, the more computer type searching will be used to do that matching. So it's not an ideal thing, but it's there, it works. You marry the CVs, the hiring manager gives the agency a brief, the agency gives the hiring manager a whole bunch of CVs. And that's the way it goes forward. And the hiring manager then is responsible for looking at those CVs and doing whatever they want with them. For some jobs, I think our experience at the moment is that for some jobs, you'll get very few. Because you're asking for something very specific. For many jobs, there are big skills gaps. For others, if you take something like a software developer, you could end up with a flood of CVs. You could end up with 30, 40, 50 CVs, depending on what you're looking for. So that's the first. The second is that, of course, you can advertise. Now, this is an advertising jobs board. It's the Institution of Engineering and Technology, and it typically costs you something like £400 a month to advertise on this jobs board. So you would put together your own ad, and you can do it, or an agent can do it for you. And of course, you've got the same facility on Robert Half. You can advertise there as well. And when somebody's looking for a job, they'll go around all these jobs boards. They'll put their CVs there, but they'll also look. So you've got a choice of actually advertising. And as I say, this is the home of engineers and technologists. And of course, if you're looking for one of them, somebody who might be a member of the Institution of Engineering and Technology, then where better to advertise than, in fact, on the institution website. So that's a terribly sensible thing to do. And you've got the ability, if you're a job seeker, of course, to then search this board. It works. It's certainly something that we've used in the past. And as I say, we're looking at something like £400 a month to do that advertising. And it gives you a back end. There's a sort of back end management system where you get you as the employer can go in and look at all the people who are applying, and people can apply online. Now, we're then back. I mentioned that there are lots of sites, some sites that are, shall we say, simply a website. And Total Jobs is one. There's nobody behind these types of things, Monster, Total Jobs, and the likes. They are simply jobs boards. They are places where you post jobs and places where people come to look for jobs. As I say, there are 3 or 4 big ones and maybe a total of 10 reasonably well-respected ones. It's the same idea as the recruitment agent, but of course there's nobody behind it. They don't have agents, just websites. And that brings us then to, I suppose, the new boy on the block, but not so new now. I think LinkedIn have been using their database of professionals who would like to network with one another. The idea of LinkedIn being linking in between people, and typically people have put themselves up on LinkedIn, and they may have 800, 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 contacts that are linked in with them. But of course, the minute they subscribe, the minute they sign up to LinkedIn, That means that they are open, provided they tick the relevant box, they're open to calls, to contacts by recruiters. So you have there, and I forget the figure, I think it's 21 million people are on LinkedIn. So you've got effectively a data set of 21 million people. Okay, take it down to the UK, and it's probably more like, I don't know, let's say somewhere around the 2 to 4 million people on LinkedIn. So you've a large data set of which a number have said, yes, I'm open to being approached. Now, the great thing now is previously, all the stuff we were talking about previously, people who were on there were actually people who were looking for a job, actively looking. The great thing about LinkedIn is that you don't actually have to be looking. All you have to do is say, yes, I'm interested. I'm interested in approaches. You're not taking any action. You're not putting a CV out there to be found. You're simply saying, look, my profile's there. And yes, if somebody wants to contact me, that means then that unlike the others, you're getting access to people who prospectively are very happy with their current employment. And so you've got people who are looking, yes, and you've people who are potentially happy, but may be open to an alternative approach. And that's the great thing about LinkedIn. So LinkedIn also allows, you can see it here, you can see the kind of thing that they actually set up. You can set up your job, and of course, LinkedIn, for a fee, of course, will actually target people with appropriate keywords. So you've got a kind of automated process where it won't target people to say, hey, you'd be good in this job, but it'll say, hey, this is a job that's open, and it allows you then to actually target individuals to suggest jobs to them, which is a very different way. And of course, the agents, if the agents were to use this, and we'll come to headhunters in a few moments because that's the kind of activity we do, and we use LinkedIn. We simply use LinkedIn with keywords, and we sit and we search for people, search for the profiles of individuals, and then we contact them. And that's a much more aggressive, much more active activity instead of the putting names on the jobs board and then expecting people to apply, or putting adverts on the jobs board and expecting people to apply, or conversely searching and dumping CVs. The idea that you can directly mine individuals, you can target individuals, go onto their profile, read their profile, determine whether they're of interest to you as a recruiter, and then send them a direct mail, an in-mail, direct mail to say, hey, look, I think you'd be good in this job. And that's a much more likely process, a better process, because the individual is being individually proposed to, and that's much more probable. So LinkedIn works. There's no question there. So what's it all about? Well, here we are. Here's the structure of the whole affair. You in your firm on the right, the agent, if there is an agent, and I said to you, of course, that the firm can go direct, shown by the top arrow. The firm can go direct into the jobs boards and simply advertise. But the firm discusses with the agent or the headhunter, of course, being the aggressive character who, I say aggressive, it's a more aggressive approach than the agent, who would then act in the middle and carry out the role of the firm in addressing the jobs boards. And out on the left, we have the population, the candidates, all the people we'd like to get at. And of course, the firm can short circuit this. The firm can do without the agent and the headhunter and the jobs boards by simply going into targeted schools, universities, and the likes, and build a position, build an attitude, to build a persona in the mind of the would-be candidates, such that the firm is seen as a good employer. And of course, that's kind of what the MOD do, the Army and the likes do, although they do advertise, of course, but they have a very good persona, and they go direct, they advertise direct, in order to get people. So that's the general structure. The traditional way of doing it is the firm gives an agent a brief. The agent then searches jobs boards, puts ads on jobs boards, individual candidates put their CVs on jobs boards, and eventually the candidates and the firm are introduced. And that's the kind of approach. Now, we do need to talk a little bit about how long all this is going to take. I'll explain in a few minutes, but I don't rate the pure agency route particularly, because it tends to be, I suppose, quite expensive for what it actually is, and the amount of effort that the agents will typically put in. And I'll explain that in a little bit. But here's a thought. Last week before, we built a specification of a person. And I've got somebody here, let's say that we've come up with, that wasn't good, we've come up with a title of a job. And I'm just going to do this real time, so let's just bomb out here. If we're going to do this, we take, for example, the spectrum engineer. Now, a spectrum engineer is a very specialist character. You don't have to understand too much about what spectrum engineers do, but other than the fact that they are scarce. Now, what we're saying on this graph is that the more unique the qualities that the person has, the greater the scarcity of that person. So the greater the unique qualities. So if I take somebody as a good example at the other end of a warehouse person probably doesn't have specifically unique qualities. They are therefore not scarce. We can go out in the local environment and put an ad in somewhere, go to a local agency for a warehouse person, and we will probably be quite successful in a very short space of time. And I've put it here, the time to find this sort of person is probably a week. If we take something like an SEO operative, SEO operatives now, it's the sort of thing that somebody traditionally goes to college and does. They learn a bit of marketing, they become an SEO operative, and it maybe take you, let's say, a month. Now, I'm being very general here, and I'm being very typical, just sort of giving you an idea. I may be wrong. It may be that these people are rarer, or it may be that the spectrum engineer is, in fact, and I'll explain something a bit weird about this when it comes to it. Although the spectrum engineer is very, very scarce, I'll give you an example of why a spectrum engineer, in fact, won't take long to find. But we can fill it all in. The translator, the medical salesperson, maybe, the chartered surveyor, and of course, one in the news recently, nurses. And nurses is a very strange one, because in principle, if you're looking for a nurse, you shouldn't take too long about it. But of course, we know that there is a scarcity, a general scarcity of nurses, and we therefore would have to promote the nurse up the scarcity or the time to find scale. And so we get the idea here simply that the certain jobs with certain skills are scarce. The more we ask for more unique qualities in the job, the longer it's going to take to find. And of course, we'll come in a moment to the idea that it's not just unique qualities, but it's how high up the scale. If we're prepared to train, then we don't have very many unique qualities, and we will therefore take very little time to find somebody. But we've got to be prepared to train them. And therefore, all that work we did last week and the week before in defining the person is effectively put in the bin, because, or it's not in the bin, it's saying that's the ideal, but we know we're not going to find that. So we're actually going to find competencies and behaviors, or we're going to ask for competencies and behaviors that are much significantly lower than that ideal that we had. And the same then can be applied to this concept, this idea here, where we are looking for higher competencies. So, for example, the spectrum engineer, I was going to say about the spectrum engineer, and there's something special there. There's probably only 50 people in the United Kingdom, maybe even only 30 people in the United Kingdom who are spectrum engineers with good skills, etc. So the higher the competencies, in principle, it should take a year. But if there's only 50 of them, then you know exactly who they are. finding them is not difficult. Then all you've got to do is unseat them, and that's a different ballgame. It's not the question of search that will take time. It's the fact that they are very rare, but you can find exactly who they are, so you can list the 50 of them, and in principle, you can go on LinkedIn and contact them all. And that makes the job a lot easier. The time to find is a lot easier, and there's a good chance that inside that 50, one or two are going to be interested in jumping ship from where they currently are. So a slight twist to that, although it's a very high competency, very scarce skills. In fact, it can be quite quick to fill simply because there are few of them and you know who they are. However, coming back to this, the higher the competencies, clearly if we are looking for a spectrum engineer and we're happy to accept a trainee, then the time to find is quite modest. We're going to universities, we're accepting that we're going to train. The same would be true of the translator. But if we expect a very senior translator who's capable of working at a very senior level, perhaps working, a vogue thing at the moment would be working in the EU, or in business, going out with trade fairs and the likes, then we could spend quite a time looking for somebody. You get the idea anyway. The more constraints we put on, and simply the message, the more constraints we put on, the longer we will have to spend looking for that person. And if I now return, hopefully all will be well. So in the end, we're looking, I suppose, for the proverbial needle in a haystack. The more we can use techniques to find the person, the more we can use the fishing metaphor to find people, to be in the right place. We're reducing the size of that haystack all the time. And we have to reduce the scope to target so that we know exactly where we're looking, such that it's not a huge haystack. It's actually a pretty small haystack. And of course, it helps if we stick a magnet in as well, and suddenly we find the needle a lot faster. How would we then go about it? Well, the first thing we're going to do in all of this, no manager, no hiring manager is an expert in this. The only people who perhaps would claim they're experts are people who are, let's say, doing it for a living. And maybe the MOD recruiters, for example, have got this down to a fine art. The majority of people don't, and they need to use what we call prototyping and skirmishing. The first thing you do in prototyping, if you're going to build this coffee percolator, then you're going to produce a prototype. You don't know how to go about recruiting the person straight away. In the same sense, you don't know how you're going to produce this coffee percolator straight away. You're going to go through the idea of a prototype. So you're going to engage, and you see it again with the fishing lure. You see the end product of fishing lure, the thing with the red at the bottom, and you see the models developed along the way. It's the idea of building what you want, but not being sure that you can get what you want in anything like sensible time. So you're going to go out into the market, you're going to dip your toe in the market, and you're going to see what's out there. And you're going to evaluate that. You're going to make changes to your whole proposal, to the way you're going to go about it. And then once you've done that, then you're ready for a full-blown campaign to find the person. But don't launch the full-blown campaign straight away. Go through the idea of prototyping, skirmishing, to get to learn and to change. A quick note then before we call to a close. Numbers game, just to say how the sort of fees. The great thing about the agencies is there's no win, no fee. The downside of that is that the agency fees, the way that the agency works, is its price model. In effect, it charges for 3 times the effort that it actually expends, because it will win, let's say, 30% of occasions. So somebody has to pay in a no win, no fee scenario. Somebody has to pay for the other 70% of wasted time. And the answer is, well, the people who win, people who get the candidates, companies who accept the candidates from the agency will pay. The amount they'll pay ranges anywhere from 10 to 30% of the first year salary, and I make the note there of first year reward. Very often it includes all benefits. typical figures are around the 15 to 20 in the middle there. Some agencies will be hammered down to 10. Others in specialist areas will perhaps argue up towards 30%. The LinkedIn search, just to give you an idea there, typically we would expect to touch 300 people for a job, for a senior job, touch 300, talk to 30 and interview 10. And that's the kind of attrition rate there. And if it's a rare breed, you might talk to 30 and end up interviewing just 3. Open adverts can be anything. Gosh, you can typically, let's say, an open advert for something that was a common job. Remember the graphs that we were talking about, and I showed you there. The open adverts typically 300 apply, 10 for the first interview, 3 for the second. And just to finish, the headhunting effort, typically we would say we need, for a senior, relatively senior engineer, junior manager type job, we typically expect 100 hours to spend. So that kind of gives you an idea of the sort of size of the task. There are lots of alternatives. Of course, the one is to tap up the universities and simply say, we will, as a matter of policy, not go out and find people, not pay these agency fees, not pay the headhunters. Of course, sometimes you have to, because that's what you need to fill. And as I say at the bottom there, internal succession. If there is no internal succession, then perhaps you have to find the senior people. But we've got the universities, the apprenticeships, and other ways. And I also put in there poaching, because clearly using LinkedIn, you can find who your competitors have and make direct approaches. In the end, it's about shaking out the degrees of freedom. The more constraints you put on this, the lower the choice you have. The fewer the constraints, if you stand on the street corner and say, look, we have this job, we're prepared to spend 2 years training you, we have no constraints other than personality and the likes, personality intelligence and the likes, the basics. We're not looking for very huge experience. We're not looking for to give confidence. We're not looking for high competency. We'll do all the training. Then, of course, you've got minimal constraints. The choice will be high, and the time taken prospectively will be relatively low. So there we are. In summary, I've aimed there to just describe search. I've given you a couple of metaphors, one being the fishing one. Look in the right place and use the right kit. That's always the first one. And the second one is needle in a haystack. The way to get down from needle in a haystack is to actually focus your role, focus your task until, of course, you've got a few people that you're either attracting to you or you're directly approaching. And that's our view on search. And over to you, Sue.
Yes, thanks, John. Just one comment and question from Isla. She says she really likes your metaphor on fishing, but her question is, as a company recruiting through a recruitment agency, do they need to be worried about GDPR and talking to people, or is that just down to the recruitment agency telling them all is okay?
Yeah, that's quite a good question. Of course, one of the problems that agencies have faced in the last, now that the GDPR came in and is now in the Data Protection Act, the agencies have to be quite careful because they can't just do what they used to do, which is to shove CVs on spec out to companies and say, hey, look, I found this job for you. They have to be mindful of privacy. They can't just do that type of activity. Companies are bound in the same way. There isn't a question. Companies and recruitment agents are bound by the provisions of the Data Protection Act, and therefore we won't go into the detail there, but they are bound by it. And you would expect, for example, to be trying to attract people. But the point about LinkedIn there is that the people there have volunteered. They have said, I am open to an approach. That's a first step. The second step is that when they are contacted, they then are able to say again, yes, I'm interested, or very quickly, no, or very quickly they just ignore you, in which case there's no particular privacy issue, no breach at all. But yes, in principle, companies and agencies, headhunters, all of the likes are all bound by the Data Protection Act.
Yeah, thanks for that, John. Okay, that was the only question we have. I'll leave the chat on once we finish and we've wrapped up. So if anybody does have any comments, then we can pick them up on the chat once I've closed off the session. So just to say, yeah, I hope you enjoyed the webinar and found some things to take away that will help you. Providing these webinars free is our way of actually showing you as management consultants we know what we're doing, we know what we're talking about, and give you a flavour of some of the things that we can help you with if you need it, as well as giving you tools that you can actually take away and use. Next webinar, that's next week, Friday the 16th of November. And in that webinar, we're going to be discussing designing decision tools to make sure that you do select the best. So hopefully you can all join us again for that one. As I said earlier, I'll keep the chat going for about 5 minutes in case anybody wants to contact us, and just finish off by saying thanks for joining us this afternoon and have a superb weekend.